review. This is being recorded, as you can tell, and we're asking you to stay on, even if you're not staying on for worship. We ask you to stay on to the after the workshop is over for some announcements that David would like to offer. So please stay on for a little bit following the workshop. And I'm going to hopefully share my screen here. Oops. Just a second. Somehow I lost my, there we go. Slideshow.
Just wanted to remind everyone there'll be chances for everyone to ask questions throughout. But while Pastor Rick is presenting, we'll try to stay muted just so we can stay on him.
Okay, I'm trying to. Beth, I might have to have you do this. I'm trying, I can't figure out how to get to my. I'm sharing the screen, but you're seeing stuff that slideshow. Can everybody see this now?
Yes, yeah, we're good.
Okay. So, as I mentioned earlier, the workshop is based much on the book and the research that we did for the book, The World is About to Turn, Mending a Nation's Broken Faith. I wrote this with a colleague of mine from the PLU faculty, Paul Ingram. And if you want more information about the book, you can check out other resources, blog posts, and so on at the website for the book, theworldisabouttoturn.com. This presentation really is going to be using these slideshows from the slides from the workshop. And I just wanted to give an introduction here before we begin the slides. Our church is facing the challenge of the unprecedented political, racial, and religious divide in this country. And this workshop is really about healing our nation's divisions. The arc of the moral universe is long, but bends towards justice, is Martin Luther King Jr.'s clever paraphrasing of a portion of a sermon delivered in 1853 by abolitionist minister Theodore Parker. Both of these ministers knew the truth of the gospel that desires and requires justice for all of God's children. One can see evidence of this in the snapshots of American history. The emancipation of slaves after the Civil War, women achieving the right to vote, Civil Rights Act in the 60s, marking the end of the Jim Crow era, a Supreme Court ruling allowing marriage for same-sex couples, and even more recently, legislation making Juneteenth a federal holiday. And yet, for many in our nation and in our world, the idea of justice seems like an unfulfilled dream. God's vision of a just society for all has yet to be realized. Unless we become too complacent, we should recall that the prophet Amos warned the people of Israel not to think that their acts of worship might cover up their sin of greed and oppression for those on the margins. In fact, Amos was quite blunt when he says, I despise your festivals. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice flow and roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. For you see, God rejects the gifts of sacrifice and praise when offered by those who are complicit in an unjust system that takes advantage of the disadvantaged and the weaker persons in society. In fact, we have much to repent for as a nation. The nation's systemic racist culture, for example, that fosters white privilege and white supremacy, and how this has led to suffering, division, hate, prejudice, and injustice on so many levels. Today, we are facing many divisions in our country, and we may wonder how we're going to bridge that political, religious, and racial divide. In order to find a way forward to a more just and civil society, we have to understand first how we got there and then how we can move forward as a nation. It begins with the myth of American exceptionalism, the belief that America was God's chosen nation, and because of that, our destiny with greatness has been both ordained and secure. This myth was perpetuated by religious and political leaders in the English colonies of North America. The New World was likened to Canaan, the promised land of the Old Testament. And the doctrine of discovery proclaimed by Pope Alexander VI gave European explorers the right to claim and exploit any land not inhabited by Christians. This gave credence to America's sense of manifest destiny and provided a rationale for both the genocide of nearly 12 million Native Americans over a number of years, as well as the slavery of non-white persons on whose back this nation was built. It was taught in the colonies that the Anglo-white race was superior and intended to be God's instrument of salvation for all others. Here are some dates that illustrate that. We have the Naturalization Act of 1790, which limited citizenship in this country to free white persons. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 decreed that African slaves and their descendants could never be citizens and had no citizenship rights. And then we have the passage of the 14th Amendment, which finally in 1868 did give citizenship to African Americans. And then the Snyder Act of 1924, which finally gave Native Americans citizenship, 1924. And then the Voting Rights Act of the 1960s that gave the right to vote in all 50 states to citizens of color. However, this act has been severely crippled in recent years by the US Supreme Court, including an act of the courts this year in 2021. In response to Black Lives Matter in 2020, Merriam-Webster Dictionary updated their definition of racism. And you can see it here, a belief that race, the primary detriment, you can read that the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. That's their new definition of racism, what racism is about, the inherent superiority of a particular race. Well, consider how we came to that understanding of particular race in this country, the white race. Consider the image of God that most of us grew up with that has fostered this myth of white supremacy. For most of us, it was a white Scandinavian Jesus and not a Palestinian Jesus like the one depicted here by a Dutch photographer based on AI research. Consider how we might understand God if we had used this image instead of a white image. Do we have a white God? Well, we have a God that's really of all colors, don't we? And is depicted in every country by every different ethnic group representing them. ELCA pastor Lenny Duncan, author of Dear Church, writes, "We need to have a final reckoning with radical evil and the forces that defy God. We have to name them and claim them. White supremacy is a systemic force in this world that defies God." He says, "I believe the only hope for mainline Christianity is to dismantle white supremacy, first in our pews and then in our communities. This is the call of discipleship. With the rise of xenophobia, racial violence, and nationalism in the United States," he says, "it is hard to deny the roots of real hurt that people of color experience in this system. White supremacy is antithetical to the gospel." It's important to note that the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America has been addressing the issue of systemic racism. At the ELCA Churchwide Assembly in 2019, the voting members passed a resolution denouncing white supremacy. They also adopted a social statement called An Apology to People of African Descent, acknowledging that as a church, we have been complicit with the oppression of people of color. And with that, I'd like to just stop for a minute for a check-in. Invite you to raise your hands, and I'm going to have Beth now lead us in this exercise.
Hello, everyone. First of all, to know where to go to if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little icon that says reactions. And if you click on that, you'll see a number of different reactions that you can choose. But the one we're asking you to choose now is to raise your hand as I ask each of these questions. So the first question for you to consider is, how many of you had heard of the doctrine of discovery? So if you can raise your hands, and I'll do a quick look.
I'm sorry, I don't have a hand. I just have a thumb.
Well, you can use the thumb then, anything you want to use.
That thumb can be yes, okay.
Sure. We're very flexible, you know, there's grace and all that.
I don't have any of
There's
that.
nothing here for no. There's nothing here for no.
No, it's just if you have heard of the doctrine of discovery. So just yes, just a thumb or a raised hand if it's yes.
There we go.
I see responses from about probably half of the people in this group, and there are 41 of us total. All right, so click it again to put your hand down or your thumb down. There you go. All right, so that's right. All right, the second question. How many of you knew that the Merriam-Webster dictionary updated their definition of racism after the Black Lives Matter rallies of 2020? Raise your hand or thumbs up, or, you know, if you want to have a party horn, whatever works for you on the reactions. Okay, looks like only about 3 of us knew that. And the third question, How many of you were aware of the actions of the ELCA Churchwide Assembly in 2019 regarding the social statements around racism and the apology to people of African descent? Oh, lots of hands. These are folks who pay attention to the Churchwide Assembly. That's great. I think this is the high watermark for us on these three questions, probably 70%. Great, thank you. So you can close your reactions. And now, Rick, we'll turn it back to you, and we'd ask everyone to make sure that you are muted.
Okay, so we'll go back to speaker view. And I'm kudos to the Virginia Synod staff that you have certainly done a good job of communicating from the Churchwide Assembly. Good to know. Okay, we're going on to the next slide. I think it's important that we talk a little bit about Christian nationalism. And I'm only going to briefly give you an overview of this, but I encourage you to check out the following website for more information. ChristiansAgainstChristianNationalism.org is the website. There's a lot of good resources there, including webinars, blogs, information that you can use in your congregations. The website itself is the product of the American Baptist Church and their Commission on Religious Liberty. In 2019, they determined that this was an incredible threat both to the church, to Christianity in this country, and to democracy. And so they've developed this website. They have a statement that a number of religious leaders across the country have signed on to. And again, I mentioned that there's a website, or rather webinars, in fact, one that I saw not too long ago featuring our presiding bishop, Elizabeth Eaton, and the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. And you can go to that website and check that webinar out. So a number of, I mentioned a number of religious leaders have signed on to the document. You can sign on as a congregation, as an individual. Your pastor can sign on to that statement if you're interested, but check out that website for more information.
Pastor Rick, I've been putting the websites in the chat for people too. So if they miss them, they'll be there.
Perfect. Thank you, Tim.
Mm-hmm.
But Martin Luther talked a lot about the doctrine of the two kingdoms, suggesting that as believers, we have a foot in both worlds. We are citizens of an earthly country and citizens of God's kingdom. We owe allegiance to one where we practice good citizenship, and we worship and serve God in the other. The problem comes when we confuse the two or try to conflate or meld them both together, which is what has happened with Christian nationalism. We saw evidence of this in the insurrection of the US Capitol on January 6th, where we saw crosses and Jesus 2020 banners that mimicked Trump signs. Doesn't matter what political party you align with, but this is a dangerous trend that we somehow try to mold our political views with our patriotism and our faith. Christian nationalism, you see, seeks to merge Christian and American identities, claiming that you can't be a patriotic American unless you're also a devout conservative Christian. So if you're not anti-gay, anti-feminist, pro-life, and don't worship the flag, you are not a patriot. This movement is a distortion of Christianity that includes a network of patriot churches across this country whose goal is to make religion and right-wing politics inseparable. Their motto is wake, pray, and slay. It's a militant ideology that demands Christianity be privileged by the state, enables white supremacy, and is in conflict with the gospel and the Constitution. They believe we are in a spiritual battle for the soul of America, and that every male is called to be a warrior who will take up arms and fight. Most recently, this Bible was publicized or advertised on Facebook as a call to action. And it speaks about the warrior God and the importance of militant Christian masculinity. Again, the movement is contrary to the gospel's value of love, justice, equity, dignity, and empathy. For instance, instead of loving our neighbor as Jesus taught, their ideology harms the neighbor, especially those of other ethnic or religious traditions. The concept of Christian nationalism gained steam with the marriage of the fundamentalist leaning churches and the political right. President Jimmy Carter had been favored by the evangelicals because of his Baptist faith and received their overwhelming support in the election of 1976. The political strategists for Ronald Reagan saw an opportunity to extract that support by using the wedge issue of abortion in the election of 1980. It wasn't that politicians cared much about abortion at that time, but they believed that they could swing the election in their favor by bringing the evangelicals over to their side. It's interesting that following Reagan's election, evangelist Billy Graham was interviewed by Parade magazine and offered this cautionary note. He said, "I don't want to see religious bigotry in any form. It would disturb me if there was a wedding between the religious fundamentalists and the political right. The hard right has no interest in religion except to manipulate it." Some wise prophetic words from Billy Graham. Well, the internet has since given Christian nationalism, along with other ideologies, an opportunity to flourish online. Religious and political leaders have found it easier to reach and influence scores of people, winning them over to their cause. The culture wars of the past 10 years have only strengthened their resolve and begin to more deeply divide the nation politically and religiously. In their book, Taking America Back for God, researchers Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry reveal some interesting data. They find a sizable portion of Americans pine for Christianity's former prominence in American civic life, and they feel that their faith is threatened and even marginalized. They fear their values are no longer the dominant ones, and their freedom to preach their moral values and share their religion could even be outlawed. Close to 50% of the population support the notion of Christian nationalism and believe that Christianity and civil society should be intimately intertwined. Whitehead and Perry reveal some interesting findings from their research, and I've listed just a few of them here. Number one, Americans who embrace Christian nationalism are less likely to believe actively seeking social and economic justice is important to being a good person. Two, they tend to be mistrustful toward those who do not meet the membership requirements of native-born, Christian, and white, namely racial minorities, non-white immigrants, and Muslims. Three, they believe that whites are as likely as African Americans to be abused by police. Four, the society they wish to live in is a society in which families are the traditional, meaning that it's men and women carrying out their proper roles. And five, Americans who embrace Christian nationalism are more likely to create, support, and maintain social boundaries that exclude non-Christians from full inclusion in American civic life. Christian nationalism is seen as a threat to a pluralistic democratic society. As Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun once remarked, a government cannot be premised on the belief that all persons are created equal when it asserts that God prefers some over others. Christian nationalist ideology is fundamentally focused on gaining and maintaining access to power. It seeks to ensure that one particular group with a specific vision for the country enjoys privileged access to the halls of power and has the ability to make the culture into its own image. It fuses national and religious symbols and identifies the attempt to legitimize its desires for the country. There is no room for disagreement or compromise. It demands complete allegiance, even worship. Those who embrace Christian nationalism share a commitment to a militant defense of a white Christian American that seems in danger of collapse. Well, ELCA presiding Bishop Elizabeth Eaton claims that Christian nationalists are actually breaking the first two commandments. So let's review that perspective from Luther's Small Catechism. The first commandment, you shall have no other gods. And what does that mean? We are to fear and love, trust, and worship God above all things, even our country. And number two, you shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God. What does this mean? We are to fear and love God so that we do not curse, swear, lie, or deceive using God's name, but instead use that very name in every time of need to call on, pray to, and give thanks to God. Oops. Christians who reject Christian nationalism point out that its tenets directly contradict the dictates found in the Bible, especially the command of Jesus to love the neighbor. The kingdom of God is where we are to love and serve others, and it's broader and more diverse than the narrow world of Christian nationalism. It is bigger than any nation or even any one faith. In fact, the fusing of a national identity with a particular kind of Christianity can actually harm our witness to the gospel, for it depends on human traditions rather than on Jesus Christ. We should reject the notion that in order to be truly American, one must be Christian, or in order to be truly Christian, one must be an American. St. John reminds us, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Christ died for the whole world, not just America. And God loves all people, not just those of our tribe or our faith tradition. So now I'm going to ask Beth to lead us in a time of response where you have a chance to share a word. We ask you to keep your remarks to about 30 seconds so that we can have as many people respond as possible in these next 4 to 5 minutes that we have together. Beth?
Oh, yeah. So if you want to comment on the first question, what was a new learning for you? Or the second question, what did you find especially helpful? Just raise your hand as we did before with the reactions, or thumbs up, whatever works for you. And I'll call on you as I see people raising their hands.
And this can be anything that I've shared up to this point.
And we just would ask you to keep your comments brief. This is
a new learning or anything you found helpful.
Yes, David Drebs.
Even if I'd learned it before, I'd forgotten. I cannot believe that it was 1924 when Native Americans were made full citizens of our country. That's just astounding to me.
Yeah, yeah.
And Timothy Crummett.
Yeah, I found it helpful, just the reminder that that we are a part of two kingdoms. Luther's idea of two kingdoms, right? We have a responsibility in both of those, and we often think that they have to be separate, but that's not really the case.
Thank you, Pat Mays.
Well, I just wanted to say that I appreciate getting the websites and hearing about the book. I'm a researcher by trade. I like to look up stuff. So yeah, I appreciate
Good.
that.
Good.
Anyone else? I'm not seeing any others.
Doris has
Oh,
her hand
Doris
up.
Howe. There, I just saw it. Doris Howe.
You're muted, Doris.
I think you can get a good fight going in just about any congregation when you suggest taking the American flag out of the premises. It's a hard sell in a lot of congregations.
I don't think you have to take the flag out of the church. Just maybe where you place it might be a helpful debate.
Out of the sanctuary.
Keith Day.
Hi. I was especially pleased to be reminded of Billy Graham's comment about the intermarriage of conservatism, extreme conservatism, and religion, and the danger of it. And he is still considered a respected person by many people who label themselves as evangelical, but tend to go more the way of Franklin Graham. Not to get into a big, but that it's kind of like that. That's a good quotable thing to have in my back pocket.
Good.
To know that. Thank you.
Claire Meissner.
Yes, I found it helpful, the discussion of the Christian nationalism. It seemed to capture some of the thoughts I've had about what's been going on and put it together in a succinct way. And
good.
because it's not always talked about in terms of sort of the Christian foundations of the political aspects of it. And I was happy to see how you brought all that together.
Thank you.
And I think that is it for now. So we can go back to your presentation, Rick.
Okay. Now I do encourage you to check out the website, Christians Against Christian Nationalism.
Did Margaret Brandell have something she wanted to say? Sorry.
Oh, Margaret has her hand up. Yeah.
I was just thinking toward the end there that why aren't we talking more about the separation of church and state? I have a issue with that with several neighbors, because I guess I live in a very GOP related neighborhood and I'm kind of an independent, but I bring that up and nobody seems to want to discuss that, or maybe they don't have their own view on it. And that's not something you mentioned, but it always has interested me, because we are supposed to be the separation of church and state, even though we're raised maybe, as in a specific religion. Why isn't that said more?
Well, Margaret, let me address that. We could save it for towards the end, but so I don't forget, let me address that right now. I appreciate you bringing that up, because if you look at the founding fathers, the documents, you'll read that from George Washington to Thomas Jefferson to John Adams and others, they were real clear about the importance of the separation of church and state. And the reason is pretty clear, that they came out of a culture in Europe that was very much enmeshed between the church and state, mostly in Europe, where either the Roman Catholic Church was very dominant, and the Pope gave often more authority than even many of the princes and kings, or even in England, where the king was actually the head of the church. And so when they came to America, they wanted to make sure that the two were separate, both to ensure the legitimacy of democracy and their government free from the influence of the church, but also to ensure that the church would be free from the influence of the government. They wanted to maintain that separation. And they were very clear in the founding documents about that. And we forget that this was a new experiment in democracy. The American experiment was a new experiment in that it was ensured by having that separation. And today that conflation or trying to meld the two back together is what's getting us into some trouble. And that's why I think it's important for us to know and understand what's happening with Christian nationalism. It's not a new thing, it's not a new movement, but it certainly has taken on a new life in the present day. And so I think it behooves every congregation to at least be aware of what Christian nationalism is about and the danger that it poses to Christianity and to our democracy in the present day. Thank you, Margaret, for that. Let's move on to the next segment. As we look at now, we've talked about some of the issues that we're facing as a church, and we want to look now at what are some ways forward. What are some ways where we can participate in the healing of our nation? And I'd like to start by talking about how our Christian faith calls us to work for justice for all people, that God's justice cannot be separated from God's love, and the clarion call to love our neighbor regardless of race, creed, or station in life. To work for justice is hard work and requires a deep level of commitment. In our new book, The World is About to Turn, my co-author and I suggest 10 ways forward as we aspire for justice and the common good. And I'm going to share with you 5 examples. First one, way 1, truth and reconciliation. Many of you are familiar with Bishop Desmond Tutu and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa. Following the tragic history of apartheid, it was determined that the only way the nation could heal and move forward was to face the truth about how Black Africans had suffered under brutal and the oppressive regime of a white government. The country had to face the truth about their past. Both Canada and Australia have recently adopted this same model to deal with the atrocities experienced by the Native or First Nation peoples in those countries. So too, the United States must face the truth of its difficult past as a nation. However, there has been a tendency to either justify or gloss over these past sins for which we need to repent, whether it be slavery, the tearing of Native children away from their families and putting them in Native boarding schools, incarcerating Japanese Americans during World War II, or the ongoing equity disparity among people of all races in this nation. If America is truly a nation based on Judeo-Christian principles, it becomes hard to deal with the things in our past that make us uncomfortable. But unless we deal with them, we're not being true to ourselves. We end up denying or ignoring the truth. Revisionist history wants to ignore the truth and make it more palatable. One example is from the 1957 textbook required in all public schools in Virginia through the 1970s, called Virginia History, Government, and Geography. Some of you may be old enough to remember this book in your classroom. Perhaps some of you read it in school. Here's chapter 29, How Negroes Lived Under Slavery, suggesting that those brought over from Africa didn't have it all that bad. And on the far left, you see kind of the fantasy picture, how they arrived on ships fully clothed and rested and were greeted with affection by their new masters. But compare that fictional account with the reality on the right, the reality of the slave ships. A very different picture. Unless we think that this was something that we've gotten past, as late as the 1990s, evangelical pastors Steve Wilkins and Douglas Wilson co-authored a book, Southern Slavery as It Was, depicting a similar fantasy. And you can see, here's a quote from the book. The life of a slave had been a life of plenty, of ample food, good medical care, and the simple pleasures, marked by a degree of mutual affection between the races. Well, there are other efforts to distort America's history and cover up the past, as we know. While the internet and media has resulted in more people becoming aware of the disparity between the white population and people of color, there are those that seek to erase the dark side of our nation's past. Did you know that 30 state legislatures are currently debating legislation that would prohibit the teaching of Black history that includes slavery, Jim Crow, and other examples of systemic racism? Privilege is having history rewritten so it doesn't have to acknowledge uncomfortable facts. Racism is perpetuated by people who refuse to learn or acknowledge this reality. We have a choice, and that is to be truth tellers. For otherwise, every lie, deception, and conspiracy theory eats away at the foundation of our democracy and the integrity of our belief in liberty and justice for all. Now, here's an example of what happened in Nazi Germany. Looking at these 5 stages. The first is, it never happened, kind of just kind of sweeping it under the rug. Or then we try to justify, saying it happened, but not the way you said. Or it happened, but it wasn't illegal. And then it happened and it was illegal, but there's nothing you can do about it now. To finally, it happened, we're proud of it, and you're a traitor for questioning it. Way 2, importance of self-awareness. Most of us recognize the importance of being self-aware, and here's a tool to assess one's degree of prejudice and openness to others. The intercultural continuum is a way to determine one's tendency to discriminate or judge those who are different. And you can see here it shows a progression that moves one from denial to adaptation. On the far left, you have the monocultural mindset. On the far right, the intercultural mindset. And we move from denial, where one misses the difference, to polarization, where one judges the difference, to minimization, where one de-emphasizes the difference. You recognize it, but you de-emphasize it, to acceptance, where you deeply comprehend the difference, and finally to adaptation, where you bridge across differences. The intercultural continuum is actually available in a kind of survey that you can take. You could even have the leadership of your congregation take it sometime. Just Google the intercultural continuum, and you can find the website where you can find the more information about using this tool. Being self-aware, terribly important. Way 3, be aware of the path to genocide. It's helpful to understand the path to genocide. It can happen very subtly. And so we need to be aware and alert. Progressive Alliance for Nonviolence has labeled this particular diagram the pyramid of white supremacy. But it could apply to any race or class of people who seek to dominate and rule it over others. We see this in countries around the world where one group, whether ethnic, religious, or political, is so obsessed with maintaining power and control that they will go to any length, including inciting violence or elimination of those who are different or opposed to them. Perhaps we could even say limiting those who have access to the ballot box would be a part of this. Way 4, engage in honest dialogue. While we may wonder what has happened to civil discourse in this country, We suggest that honest dialogue and storytelling can help build relationships and lead to a better understanding of those who have a different cultural, religious, or even political perspective. In fact, I just became aware of a website, again, that you might want to check, called Braver Angels. And I'm not sure if it's braverangels.com or braverangels.org, but it's an organization that's made up of people from both the red and the blue who are committed to honest dialogue, honest, respectful dialogue. They have workshops, they have webinars, they will give you ways that you can engage people who have very different beliefs from yours. But here is a particular kind of guidelines that were developed by Eric Law, who was the executive director for Kaleidoscope Institute. We have this in our book with his permission. And it's called Respect. If you're engaging in honest dialogue, to use this as a guideline for the group to say, here's how we're going to engage in dialogue with one another. Take responsibility for what we say or feel without blaming. Practice empathetic listening. Be sensitive to differences in communication styles and the feelings of others. Ponder what we hear and feel before we speak. So, don't just say the first thing that comes to mind, but kind of meditate on it a little bit so you can have an appropriate response. Examine our own assumptions and perceptions, not just those of others. So not just pointing the finger, but saying, what about me? How are my feelings perhaps a little prejudiced or one-sided? Keeping confidentiality for the sake of a healthy community. So when you're in dialogue with others, always ask, is this something we can share or not share? Tolerate right or wrong, meaning we can agree to disagree. So set aside what's right or wrong for the moment and say, let's talk through. We can agree to disagree, but let's get everything out on the table and talk it through. So these are just some simple guidelines for honest and respectful dialogue. Finally, way 5, stand in solidarity with others. Xenophobia and anti-Semitism are flourishing worldwide, and especially in this country. God calls us to stand in solidarity with our sisters and brothers who are suffering injustice, as the following stories suggest. We all remember the tragic massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018, where a domestic terrorist murdered 11 worshipers during a Sabbath service. Here in Seattle, clergy of various faith traditions contacted a local synagogue and arranged for a vigil, a candlelight vigil, to show their solidarity. So people of various faith traditions gathered with the Jewish community to show that we were in solidarity with them. And another example, in response to a surge of violence against Jews in Sweden, a Hasidic rabbi in Malmo organized a protest march intended to be a demonstration of faith to stand up to the haters. He invited both Jewish and non-Jewish citizens to wear the traditional skull caps in protest against anti-Semitism. Members of the congregation were joined by many others not of the Jewish faith who wore skull caps in solidarity, and the walk proceeded in a peaceful manner. Following the Malmo example, there are now regular such walks, not just in Malmo, but also in Stockholm and even in Berlin. Scripture is the story of a loving God who liberates oppressed people throughout human history. This sacred story of God's healing love and liberation is our inheritance and must be our legacy as a church. So we must all continue to work for the common good at the local level, following the admonition of the prophet Micah. For what does the Lord require of us? But to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. I'd like to close with these words from William Whitla, who wrote the text for a familiar hymn that reflects this call for justice. He wrote it in 1989, just after the events in Tiananmen Square, and about the time the mothers of the disappeared in Argentina were making their appeal on the world stage. You may remember singing this in church. It's in their ELW. That streams of living justice flow down upon the earth. Give freedom's light to captives. Let all the poor have worth. The hungry's hands are pleading. The workers claim their rights. The mourners long for laughter. The blinded seek their sight. Make liberty a beacon. Strike down the iron power. Abolish ancient vengeance. Proclaim people's hour. Your cities built to music. We are the stones you seek. Your harmony is language. We are the words you speak. Our faith we find in service, our hope in others' dreams, our love in hand of neighbor, our homeland brightly gleams. Inscribe our hearts with justice, your way the path untried, your truth, the heart of stranger, your love, the crucified. And finally, this last slide is a quote from Emma Lazarus, an American poet whose words are enshrined on the Statue of Liberty, who also wrote, "Until we are all free, we are none of us free." We have some time for questions and comments. I invite you to use the chat feature to make your remarks for our Q&A time, and I'll ask Beth to monitor that for us. Thank you for your participation, and if you'd like to contact me, you have my website below, rwrouse@comcast.net, and know that these slides are going to be posted on the Power of the Spirit website. So please put your Q&A or your questions and comments in the chat feature, and I'll be happy to respond.
Would you like to stop sharing your screen and maybe we can see you a little bit bigger? Or?
You bet, I will do that.
Thank you.
Let me go ahead and get out of the show here.
All right, the first comment is, I see a real tension between tolerance, as you have mentioned, and the need to call out injustice when it is observed.
Did I stop sharing my screen?
Yes, it's just fine. Now, if everyone goes up to view, they can put it on gallery and we can see everyone's smiling face.
Here we go. Here we go.
So the first comment is, I see a real tension between tolerance, as you have mentioned, and the need to call out injustice when it is observed.
Thank you. That's a good comment from William France. Thanks for that observation. Yeah, I'm not sure that tolerance is not necessarily, I mean, one can tolerate in terms of having different points of view, but I'm not sure one can tolerate injustice. I think that when injustice gets at the point where it is harmful to others, I don't think we want to tolerate that. I think we want to stand up and speak loudly about what that injustice is all about. It's different from, again, like I say, different from tolerating a different point of view versus when we see injustice occur. That would be my take on it. But thank you, William, for that comment.
Others, comments or questions? What are the best ways for the church to stand up and speak without getting sucked into the partisan divide? I don't want my church known as the red or blue church. We want to be God's church, right?
Well, first of all, I want to say there's a great quote. Probably won't be able to find it right away, but it's attributed to a Southern pastor. I want to see if I can find it. Here we go. Preaching that we are to love our neighbor, welcome the stranger, and stand up for the marginalized does not mean we are making political statements. It means you are making biblical statements. Think about that for a minute. I think it's also important to note that in the ELCA Constitution, pastors, when they're ordained, are required to speak up for justice. And if you look at your baptismal covenant, it also suggests that you take a stand for justice as a Christian. So when we talk about justice issues, we're not being political. We're being true to our faith tradition and to the Bible. If you read read the not just the Old Testament, but also look at the gospel and some of Jesus' comments, Jesus was forever standing with the marginalized, was standing up for and speaking out against injustice. So I think we need to think about what is it that's political and what is it that's biblical. I don't think we don't have to couch ourselves as red or blue, but what does it mean to be true to our faith and true to what God is calling us to be and to do as faith-filled Christians? I also think that it helps to educate people. So we don't go around just batting people on the head or saying you're right, I'm wrong, you're wrong, I'm right, or whatever. It's a matter of educating people about what is really happening. In our congregation, we recently had a series on racism and on sexism. There's some wonderful resources available through Augsburg Fortress. Particularly Spark House has a series called Dialogue, which helps congregations deal with some of these difficult issues. And a lot of it is just educating people, helping them understand what are the issues at hand so that they can make more informed choices and decisions around those issues of racism, sexism, and other issues we're facing as a church and as a nation. Other comments or questions? Well, while we're waiting for, what do you say to someone who responds, well, that's just your opinion? Thanks, Tim. Well, I guess you could say, we all have a right to our opinion, and let's talk about that. I'd like to hear more about your opinion. And so we can have maybe engage in an honest dialogue about, I've shared, and sometimes, it's waiting to share your opinion after you've heard from another person. Respectful dialogue is saying, let's find out not just what we have to argue about, but maybe find out what do we have in common. Is there some place we can agree on? Not just agree to disagree, perhaps, but to say, are there some areas here that we have something common?
Here's another comment, Rick, from Claire, who says, in another state, I had a pastor who preached about contacting our state representatives to express a particular view. It wasn't my view, and I felt he had gone too far because I thought some issues were matters of conscience between you and God.
Okay. Yeah, I think that if he wants to go ahead and contact his representatives, he or she, I would agree with that. I mean, I think you can encourage people certainly to make their opinions and their concerns known to their representatives, but I don't agree that you should tell somebody necessarily what needs to be said. Now, if you're working with a particular organization, I mean, there are exceptions to that. For example, Lutheran Refugee Services, which does an amazing job of helping resettle people from other countries, and they have been at work ever since World War II. They've been a major force in resettling people and working with congregations. And when their funding was about ready to cut off, we were encouraged to write our congressman and our senator and say, please don't cut out the funding for these organizations that are doing such an important work. So I think there are times when it's okay to encourage a particular issue, such as funding a cause. And there are other times when maybe it's not appropriate, particularly if it's very politically minded, say, you should vote for a particular candidate. I think, again, that's a matter of conscience.
We are right at time. I'm going to sneak one more in because I think it's an interesting idea from Diane. She says, I think a beginning place in any congregation is to reconcile the truth about their history. My congregation is over 200 years old. We dug into some county historical records and discovered that some of our charter members were slave owners.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Thank you for sharing that, Diane. I just also wanted to comment on Margaret's comment. Should this be a Sunday school class or put into a course? Again, you have the slides. I'd be happy to have a conversation with your congregation. I've been doing a lot of online teaching. And if you have a congregation that's interested in the material that I've shared in this workshop, I'd be happy to do an online session with a congregation. So I'll just put that out there, David and Timothy. But thank you for your participation. This has been I hope a helpful and worthwhile workshop for you as you continue to your journey in the power of the Spirit. And please hang around now for some announcements.
Yeah, we'll
Thank
get
you.
moved to the big room, and in the big room is where we'll have our announcements.